the Medical School HQ podcast, session number 67.
In reality, is that they work maybe 10 weeks during the summer and full time. And then in the semesters, they are doing 10 to 15 hours a week.
Hey, this is Z-Dog MD, rapper, physician, legendary turntable health revolutionary, and part-time gardener. And you're listening to the Medical School HQ podcast, hosted by the irredeemably awesome Ryan Gray.
Welcome back. I am your host, Dr. Ryan Gray, and I believe that competition amongst your pre-med and medical student peers is detrimental to becoming a great physician. In this podcast, we show you how collaboration, hard work, and honesty are critical to becoming a superior physician in today's healthcare environment. Welcome back, folks. In today's podcast, my guest, Dr. Jose Cavazos, and I are going to show you what pre-med life is like as a possible MD PhD student. Dr. Cavazos, who is the Assistant Dean for the MD PhD program at the University of Texas Health Science Center San Antonio School of Medicine, brings you the voice of an admissions member telling you what a successful applicant looks like to him. We cover life after medical school as well for an MD PhD graduate. All that and a lot more. Dr. Cavazos, welcome to the show. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in getting into medicine?
Okay, my name is Jose Cavazos. I'm a professor at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center in San Antonio. Professor of neurology. I am an epilepsy researcher and clinician, and I'm the assistant dean for the MD PhD program. Now, your question, Ryan, is how did I get to this spot? And my path is a little bit atypical in the sense that I started with an MD and then decided that I wanted to pursue more research and push for a PhD, and then I did my residency. And after my residency, I then started faculty formally, first in Colorado and now here in Texas.
Okay. So you started off purely as an MD graduate, and then later on in life figured out that you liked the research.
As I was going through the pre-medical education component, I just got fascinated with the basis, the fundamentals, and I felt that I was not getting enough critical thinking or substance, let's put it this way. And I often tended to go back to why. And those questions of the why kept bugging me quite often. And perhaps that's one of the signs that undergrads, pre-medical students right now must be considering if they are fascinated by the specific reasons and willing to contribute as to why certain pathophysiological processes happen, et cetera, et cetera. Biomedical research and MD PhD programs are certainly one possibility.
Okay, and we'll get into that a little bit more. I definitely want to get into what pre-med students should be thinking, but I want to hit on your path a little bit more. Where did you do your medical education?
Okay. So I'm an international graduate. I did my medical school in my hometown. I was born in Monterrey, Mexico. Texas used to be part of my state. So I went and did my medical school there. I'm dual citizen in my country, in Mexico. It's a 7-year program. And so it is a pre-medical undergrad and medical together. it's, as I said, is somewhat atypical too, but nevertheless, that's the way. Compared to other graduates or paths of some of my colleagues, this is not an unusual path, but it is different than the MD PhD program.
Okay.
Itself.
Okay. Now, I don't know how briefly you can talk about it, but I haven't had any international grads on that I can think of. Where you're going to be session 67, so 67 straight weeks. I did have a Caribbean student on, so another international graduate. Mm-hmm. What was it like to come back to the States to practice? Any big hardships that you had to overcome, or did you find it easy and was maybe just a little bit more paperwork?
More paperwork. There's no question about it. Every state has wants everything, all the paperwork, all the way to the back. I am licensed in just Texas at the present time, but originally, I did part of my training in Wisconsin, so I actually took the licensing test in the state of Wisconsin. I then went and obtained did my residency at Duke, and I got a medical license at North Carolina, and then subsequently I went to Colorado and again did the entire paperwork again, and lastly I came to Texas. So what I mean by paperwork is considerable and is actually much more. It's larger. Now, obviously, as an international graduate, you always are questioned as to the depthness of your knowledge. I can tell you that that's certainly something that I push me to be in the top 5% or 10% of my specialty, and I certainly, if you look at all my scores across the board in the specialties, they are top notch.
Good. Okay. Yeah, it's definitely something we'll cover more in depth later. As
a program director, I'm also a program director, so I also evaluate individuals who are coming from multiple other schools. And I can tell you that one important aspect to understand about international medical graduates is that there's a lot of heterogeneity of the strength of their programs. Some are amazing. Mm-hmm. Some are not equivalent to the education and quality controls of the United States.
Yeah. And that's something I try to get across to students. Just because you go to Harvard doesn't mean you have a free ride anywhere.
Absolutely.
You get out of it what you put into it, no matter where you go.
Exactly.
And you mentioned you're a program director. I'm assuming it's for neurology. You haven't mentioned that you're a neurologist.
Yes, I did said at the beginning that I was a neurologist, but nevertheless, I'm a program director for a sub-fellowship, a fellowship of neurology, and that's Clinical Neurophysiology, which is the guys who read brain waves and do EMGs.
Okay. The squiggly lines.
Yes, indeed.
Now, my wife, Allison, who's a co-host on the show sometimes, she's a neurologist. I think I mentioned to you in an email.
I see.
And we were both very skeptical at the start of her medical training, her neurology training, about what those squiggly lines meant. But now she swears there's stuff in there that she can read.
You bet.
So let's talk a little bit about being a pre-med and those considerations about going to an MD PhD program. Obviously, the decision to go to medical school is a big one all in of itself.
Mm-hmm.
How are pre-medical students supposed to know that an MD PhD is what they want to go into?
Well, that's actually a bit of a revelation that happens when you, as a pre-med undergraduate, perhaps to become rounded, do a little bit of research in the lab. typically a wet lab. And what happens is in those settings, you might be exposed to individuals who are clinician scientists, or you might have a mentor who is a clinician scientist. In some institutions, that may be one of the cases. You may be exposed to students who are undergoing this path. Now, truly speaking, let me just backtrack and say, as program director for an MD PhD program, what you are looking for in an applicant is an individual who has had sustained research experience for several years. And that is one of the reasons why when we're reaching out and doing recruiting, we go to the early classes, because what you want to say is indicate that this is a potential avenue, and if you want to go that route, you have to do a series of things. Now, there are people who are late bloomers, and in their, as I said, as they are doing their requirements for having a balanced application, and checking all the boxes of volunteering and clinical, etc. You say, well, there's a section for research. Let me do some stuff on it. So as people do that particular box, they may say, wow, this is fascinating. And in my particular case, I didn't have that experience as a pre-med. And so, certainly that was what called me to say, well, let me take a gap year after my medical education to pursue some research, because I understood, and then during my clerkships, I was exposed to individuals who were clinician scientists. I did several, 6 months at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, and some of the individuals who I was exposed were clearly clinician scientists with a very different career path than the traditional clinician educator or clinician taking care of patients.
You mentioned what you're looking for as a director of an MD PhD program. Several years of research. Now, if I do the math, a typical pre-med student is applying at the end of their junior year, or the summer. And if you do the math on several years of research, they either know starting out as a freshman very early on that they need to jump on this, or they're already behind the curve, it sounds like.
Well, we have a mixture. Certainly, the most important aspect that we look is what are the opportunities that individuals have. So it is not the same for an individual who is going in an R1 or an Ivy League type of institution where research labs are pushed all the way from first year in your freshman classes. And those opportunities are discussed quite openly by the faculty, and in some extent it is expected for some individuals to have those types of experiences, regardless if they are going to go straight into the MD path, period, or PharmD or whatever other pre-health path. But so individuals who might be in, a community college transitioning to a major university or something of that nature, they are going to be starting their junior year and they say, oh, wow, this exists. And they certainly will be behind. Now, we look at those candidates too, quite keenly. And essentially, the issue is from the time that they make a decision that this is something that they want to pursue, the question is, what they have done the most with their opportunities. I mean, some individuals, you can also argue that maybe coming from an Ivy and very shallow record. And you will say, perhaps, they did not take advantage of the opportunities. And so the question is, what are these individuals made of?
Okay. I want to ask a question about something you mentioned earlier for us that don't know the research side of the house. What you mentioned wet lab. Can you expand on what that is real quick?
Sure. A wet lab experience is the typical pre-medical basic science discipline. Let me say biochemistry, genetics, molecular biology, physiology, pharmacology, biochemistry, I mean, you name it. So those are the traditional disciplines that individuals will eventually will get PhDs on. Neuroscience, for example, will be in my case. I mean, that's my PhD on. Now, a wet lab means that you do research in biomedical research in a laboratory where experiments are taking place. And the reason why it's called wet lab is because, I mean, you typically are mixing solutions and they are typically wet. But I mean, in truth of, I mean, that is in compare, for example, to other types of experiences which are okay and adequate and sometimes what we're looking for, such as working with patients and doing clinical translational research. But even in those cases, what we're looking is for some research that is able to assess fundamental questions about the biology of what's going on. As you move closer to healthcare outcomes or community type of research, the level of the scientific inferences that you are able to develop is they tend to be less and less. And so you essentially recognize, for example, that there is an association between, let me just say something simple, tobacco smoking and lung cancer. So an clinical association like that, in order to be proven, you have to do a series of scientific tests where you are able to dissociate the compounds that are associated with this problem and assess the level of carcinogenesis, understand the mechanism, and understand how the pathophysiological process is about. And so that's typically done in pre-medic, animal research or in biological sample research. I mean, it doesn't necessarily need to use animals, but biological tissues.
Okay, good. Now we got that straight. One of the big questions we get all the time is, do I have to major in chemistry? Do I have to major in biology? And those are typically general going to medical school.
Mm-hmm.
If I want a PhD now, that same question still exists. Are you looking specifically for science majors, or can a humanities major get all the prereqs and get their research in and still be considered on the same level as a science major?
Yes, I mean, many cases. I mean, let me just, tell you an individual who we would love to have as an accepted student in my program. She began as a music and philosophy major and actually completed that, but realized in her last year that she really loved research. And then in the subsequent post-bac and studies, pre-med, etc., did studies to have the pre-medical requirements. So it's possible. One obvious concern of an individual who is coming with that track is a little bit how whether the quality of upper level courses beyond the pre-medical requirements is sufficient to be able to have challenged themselves to push themselves to the next level. Now, let's say that conversion happened in their junior year, so that's understandable. You quite often MD PhD students do a 1 year or 2 year postbac, and where they are completely immersed in research to improve their qualifications. But many of our top candidates across the country are individuals who are just straight coming from undergraduate, typically from a solid undergraduate program where they have had research experiences throughout three years, or at least 2 years solidly throughout their training.
Okay. You mentioned that you took a gap year, and you mentioned that a lot of students take a post-bac or maybe gap years and what you just said, immerse themselves in research. If a student out there is thinking, wow, I think maybe I want to do an MD PhD, but I don't have that much research, let me take a gap year before I apply. During that gap year, would you consider 1 day a week in that lab over that year immersion? Or
Nope.
would you consider full-time 5-6 days a week full-time?
Well, it will be it will be really more the 5-6 day type of immersion to make up for. When we're talking about an individual having, for example, 2 to 3 years of research experience coming from college, what we're thinking in reality is that they work maybe 10 weeks during the summer and full time. And then in the semesters, they are doing 10 to 15 hours a week as their continuity, along with taking a full load of classes, et cetera, which will be essentially being challenged to proceed with this. Now, we're looking, obviously, earlier on, many of these undergraduates are doing these research experiences completely unpaid. But, postbacs are typically, funded positions. And so, for example, one of the premier places I will be actually recruiting there in a couple of weeks is at NIH. And so the NIH has an immense, variety of research laboratories. They have a program called the IRTA program, and it is a program where qualified students who have just finished their undergraduate training, or they are about to finish, they apply to this program, and they are able to be selected and paid to work in a lab, on a world-class lab, research lab. And so those are amazing opportunities that many students have.
As long as the government doesn't shut down anymore, please. Well, that's another story.
Indeed.
So, MD PhD obviously is a very unique, very hard path, a different path, a longer path. Do you have to be an MD PhD to be a physician scientist?
No, but it gives, so let's start talking about what MD PhD programs are. MD PhD programs, essentially, you still are going to be going out to a series of interviews. That's the last, and maybe invest $5,000 or $6,000 in between interviews, applications, etc. in AMCAS. But once you're done with that, you enter a situation where your entire tuition fees for the MD, for the PhD are entirely paid. In addition to that, you are giving a stipend, certainly a predoctoral student stipend, typically somewhere in the range of 22 to 32 perhaps in some cities. In my program, we provide 26,000, but given San Antonio's low cost of living, that's actually probably much more than the 32 that may be getting in New York City. So in terms of being able to afford some decent living situation. In any case, after completing your PhD and MD, and you're paid that throughout each of the 7 to 9 years of both medical and PhD education. Now, that's the majority of the MSTPs, or actually all the MSTPs, as well as the many of the fully funded MD PhDs.
And explain real quick the MSTP.
Okay, so there are 45 programs in the United States that receive NIH funding in a training award called the Medical Scientist Training Program. This is a NIH T32 application to the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. It's a application that essentially is a review, programmatic review by a study section that the training that goes on in that particular institution is fantastic. There are other NIH awards, which are, for example, F30s. These are individual awards that are obtained by MD PhD students. My program, for example, has one of the highest number of F30 awards per MD PhD student, and the reason for that is because as we don't have an MSTP funding, we're a relatively young program. Those programs typically have been around for 15, 20 or more years before they obtain that type of funding. You go for other types of, or you apply for other types of funding. My program in particular, it's going for applying for the MSTP funding. But that essentially is they are funding about 20% of the slots of the positions that exist in a particular program. Now, if you look at MD PhD programs, there are programs that have the mega programs. There's a couple that have over 150 MD PhD students. That's starting from including all the students from year 1 to year 7, 9, 10 in some rare cases. And then there are about 10 more programs that are over 100 positions total. And that means that, the mega programs, they may have 25 positions per year. The medium-sized programs or the large programs may have there's actually 13 programs with more than 13 positions per year. But, most programs are going to be somewhere in the 5 to 10 positions per year. And the size of the program is about 60 to 80. And that will say out of those 45, the great majority, or at least 50%, are in that sweet spot.
Okay. Are there any programs where a student has to pay for their MD PhD program, or are all of the spots paid for?
Well, there are 109 programs, or 109 schools indicated that they had MD PhD students in 2012. I have not looked. The data for 2013 was just released. But there are some of those who are not fully funded, and they are giving them some, they are paying for the PhD portion, but not the MD. Some of actually the Ivy Leagues have some extra spots that, because they're prestige, some people would rather have it from those places, and they end up paying for the MD portion of tuition, which can be rather hefty.
Expensive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the advantage of an MD PhD student is that they don't really accumulate debt during their MD or PhD. They do not accumulate debt, obviously, after they become residents or postdocs. And then they have the ability to use the NIH loan repayment program to pay back even the undergraduate loans. And so, in a sense, it's a mechanism that allows that not to think about financial considerations if you keep doing this program or keep doing this career path. Now, in the end, we do not make as much, as private practitioners, and so there's reasons why you do this, because you love to do research. You want to be challenging and being able to influence health and have a footprint that is much larger than just helping this particular patient. Now, as clinician scientists, we're able to still see patients and still be able to do research, and that's a very rewarding career for many of us. Most of us are going to be in academic careers, and many of us are doing basic science investigation. Some of us do clinical science investigation, and some of us are able to really bridge the gap between bench research and all of these publications and discoveries, and be able to bring it up to patients.
Okay. But you mentioned a couple things that an MD PhD that's out working now out of school can do. Are there any other unique things that an MD PhD graduate can do that maybe a normal physician can't?
Well, another thing is industries, and I'm talking about pharmaceutical industry, but also device industry, is fairly interested in individuals with this type of training who are able to translate premium research discoveries into clinical platforms. And that idea of doing taking preclinical trials and getting phase 1 and phase 2 studies done, that it's a very particular expertise. Many of these individuals that go into pharmaceutical of this type are individuals who have practiced for a couple of years, maybe 2-3 years, or they have done some clinical medicine, but at the same time they have gone in to do postdocs or projects where they do this type of discovery. Now, some of us do move eventually into administration, like I am. This is a little portion of my time, relatively speaking. Every week I still see patients. Every week I interpret some squiggle lines, EEGs, which is what I do as one of the neurophysiologists. And every day or every week, I'm also involved with research proposals, reviewing papers, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. So there's a lot out there.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Now, you did say, and you asked the question about individuals who just do the MD and then go on for research. Why are not they? If you look at the average age of an individual who gets the first R01 and is a physician, the age for those who are MD PhD an MD is exactly the same. So what happens for the MDs who are obtaining further, research R01 NIH grants, etc., is that they earn their stripes by doing additional research training as postdocs after their completion of their either residency or during their residency. So there's no shortcuts. The advantage of doing the MD PhD, in a sense, is that you're able to take, we accept a student for the program. We don't accept it necessarily so that they become, medical physics or biochemistry or geneticist or whatever. What we're looking for is the best candidate. And you're able to take that risk of doing a rotation in another field that may not be necessarily what you had been exposed as an undergraduate in researcher. And in the contrary, once you have done and finished or you're doing your residency, you typically are more advanced in terms of your lifetime career. You may be already having a significant other, you may have children, so the amount of risks that you take are much smaller, and so you go more for a sure thing, and so that's on the other hand, if you persist, you have a very high chance of succeeding, but not as many people enter successfully at that level.
Okay. You mentioned just now what you would consider a strong candidate for an MD PhD program. I know it's hard to say this is the perfect candidate that we want because every application is different. Mm-hmm. One question we get all the time is what is the minimum amount of research do I need? Is there a number that you guys look for, or is it just more quality type research?
It's more about quality and depthness. There are people, for example, that have done 5 years of research, including some post-bac or whatever, but they were acting as technicians, and their thinking is still at a technician level. There are individuals who do a year and a half of research, but gosh, they came up with independent ideas. They, the letters of recommendation from the PhD, from their research advisors are critical. Now, on the side of, the usual thing that we compare to other MD applicants, we do need to convince the medical school that this individual is interested in becoming a clinician too. So they need to have done some shadowing, but rather than doing 500 hours of shadowing and things, or volunteering and etc., we're looking for 100 hours of shadowing, a little bit of volunteering, and mostly research, and it is quality, as you indicated.
I'm glad you brought up the technician portion, because we get the same problem with undergrads who, quote unquote, volunteer in the hospital. And what they're doing is like I did. I made the mistake of going and showing up saying, hey, I want to volunteer. And I got put at the information desk showing people where the elevators were. How does a student start off and get that quality research experience? How do they be a little bit more forthright and say, this is what I want to do, give me the good stuff? Or should they start in more of that technician role, get a little experience, and then have those conversations of, okay, now I want to be higher up on the totem pole? So
typically that's the way it works. It is pretentious to come seriously. As an undergrad with, give me the good stuff, and by the way, I don't know anything, and I don't have any experience whatsoever. So you need to earn your stripes. No, we are not expecting necessarily publications. They are a bonus. And how generous some research advisors are in terms of putting individuals as, third, fifth, whatever, 10th author versus, having a single publication, but they are first author or second author, or they had a significant take on a particular project. So often, even if it is, I'm gonna start working with this postdoc or this graduate student to take this particular project to another piece. But it is, rather than I'm just washing dishes for the lab, which is another common equivalent to what you were indicating, is I want to take a particular area of the science and, and really help out. So what you do is, certainly you might start as the lab washer, but you open your eyes to everything that goes on, and you start asking questions. You start reading about it. You start talking yourself into the research lab of what's going on, and it may not be necessarily that you are having those conversations with the PI. You might be having those conversations initially with your, the supervising graduate student or supervising postdoc or even technician. And then as you understand better what goes on in a particular lab or a particular area of the science, then you start thinking and owning some aspects of that research. And then you need to make it known to the PI what your aspirations are. And most PIs are very open to this because, some of them say maybe this kid comes back into our MD PhD program if they are in one of those places and even do their PhD in my lab. So, certainly that's a very good thing that can happen.
There's a great quote that I love that says, "The harder I work, the luckier I get."
You bet.
And that's exactly what you said. You put in the effort, and opportunities will come if you want them.
Indeed.
Do you have any final words of wisdom for a pre-med student out there that's possibly looking at an MD PhD program?
Well, obviously, SDN has a fantastic and very active physician scientist forum. Sometimes it's depressing because some NIH is not giving grants, etc. But the reality is that even in 2013, 14% of the ideas that were submitted to the NIH, which, by the way, they were a record number, got funded. And the reality is that MD PhD students and graduates are going to have a better chance of competing for those awards and being able to stay in academia during the tough years as compared to the very plentiful days. Those happen. We had doubling of the NIH in 2003, but we're losing those efforts by inflation and other measures.
Okay.
Lastly, obviously, the YouTube link. Some people may be able to take a look at what the stats are. Look at the AAMC website. There is a very nice portion for MD PhD students and applicants. And lastly, email 10 fairs. In July, there's a great fair at the NIH that is open to all pre-med students who may want to see all of the MD PhD program directors are pretty much up there. And so it's a great opportunity to see and compare and talk to MD PhD students, directors, administrators, etc.
Wow, I hope you got a ton of great information out of that. Dr. Cavazos was kind enough to take some time out of his day and share what it's like. Obviously, I know you like to hear information from admissions members because when I was a pre-med, that's who I wanted to hear information from. So Dr. Cavazos, as the assistant dean for the MD PhD program and also the assistant dean for the medical school as a whole, shared with us his thoughts on what a successful applicant looks like. And so take this information with the realization that it's one person, it's one admissions member. So every school looks for something different. Every admissions committee has a different job, a different role when they're evaluating students. And so that's why it's hard to give concrete advice to you, because every school is different. Every year it's different. So take that with a grain of salt, but a lot of great information that I hope you can use today as you move forward on your path to becoming a physician. I do want to thank 3 awesome listeners for taking a couple minutes and leaving us 5-star ratings and reviews in iTunes. We had Lessa RF, who said, the best podcast for pre-meds, especially non-traditionals such as myself. She said the subject is A+++++. That's awesome. I wish I could put that into my AMCAS application. We had Pearson, said, excellent podcast, terrific podcast for diverse medical and pre-medical audience. And RJ Stowe 2 says, I'm new to this podcast and have selected podcasts randomly, but everyone I've chosen has incredibly benefited my journey. Awesome. Thank you, RJ Stowe 2. Thank you to those 3 people. If you haven't taken a minute or two to leave us a rating and review, that's okay. You can do it right now. Literally, it takes about a minute or two. You go to medicalschoolhq.net/iTunes, and you can leave the rating and review there. If you listen on Stitcher, you can rate us in Stitcher's app or online. And so we greatly appreciate it. That increases our visibility in iTunes, so when other students are out there looking for something to listen to, they can find us. We want you to continue this conversation. If you liked what Dr. Cavazos had to say, if you want to share some stories or questions about the MD PhD world, go to medicalschoolhq.net/67 as in episode 67. That is our show notes page, and at the bottom, there's a comment section where you can leave some comments and we can continue this conversation. You can also say hi to us on Twitter. I'm at Medical School HQ. Folks, as always, I hope the information provided to you today will help better guide you on your path to becoming a physician. And as always, I hope you join us next time here at the Medical School Headquarters.